Ash Williams from the Evil Dead franchise, and Guts from Berserk. Ironically, both these characters are some of my favorite fictional protagonists of all time, and I came to love both series independent of one another. When you sit down and think about it, these two characters, and hell, these two franchises have a lot more in common than you realize. Even though Berserk is primarily classified as a dark fantasy, it definitely branches into the horror genre, and if you don't think so, well, you probably haven't made it to the eclipse just yet. Evil Dead, of course, at least the original, is definitely a horror film, but as the franchise continues, it falls a little bit more into the horror comedy realm. Not that Berserk doesn't have its fair share of comedy too, but certainly not as frequently. Also, a lot of the Evil Dead humor comes with the absurdity of the situations, which Berserk has a lot of absurdity too, but it's just a matter of a differing tone. The wackiness in Evil Dead will make you say things like, "What the fuck?" Whereas the absurdity of Berserk will make you say things like, "What the fuck?" Sure, both characters in terms of personality couldn't be further apart. Guts' painful backstory and deep-rooted trauma has massive consequence on his mental state, and he often struggles against his own inner darkness. Ash, on the other hand, is a master at suppressing that shit down and pretending that it doesn't exist. Neither of these solutions are particularly healthy, and so I'd recommend both of them see a therapist, but to each their own. Guts was trained to be a swordsman and a mercenary from birth, and Ash was just a dopey college kid that was forced to survive. But both of these series heavily revolve around demonic forces as their primary antagonist, and these two characters who are human having to struggle against it. In Berserk, we have a variety of mythological monsters like trolls and ogres and more, all coming from another dimension called the astral world, alongside human beings that willingly make a sacrifice of what's tethering them to their humanity in order to become monstrous demons called apostles. In the Evil Dead series, the source of all these demons come from the Necronomicon, a book that's a conduit to the demon realms, which I guess you could say is similar to the Bela in Berserk, although the Bela is a lot closer to the Lament configuration from the Hellraiser franchise, and I made a video on all of those connections way back in the day. I'll link down below. Anyway, most of the demons in the Evil Dead franchise possess living humans, thus turning them into monsters, oftentimes advancing and disfiguring their physical forms, not too unlike an apostle from Berserk. And although Guts and Ash don't have a ton in common personality-wise, you could call them both anti-heroes, or as I like to call them, reluctant heroes. Somebody that, although they are the protagonists of the story and ultimately do a lot of good things, they don't make their decisions based on needing to save the day, and oftentimes would just rather be left alone. Guts is usually put into situations where saving people just kinda happens to be a casual result of what his main objectives are. And Ash would rather just ignore everything, go home, not deal with the situation, and just retire to Jacksonville, Florida, but instead is constantly thrust back into these situations. Both Guts and Ash deal with a singular, huge, nightmarish event, losing all of their friends. In the case of Guts, it's the eclipse, and in the case of Ash, it's that night at the cabin. In the eclipse, Guts' entire mercenary group is devoured by demons except for Casca, where something arguably much worse happens to her, but we don't need to go into detail on that again. If you know, you know. As for Ash, a weekend trip with his girlfriend, his sister, and his friends turns into a desperate struggle for survival as they all get possessed one by one, and he becomes the only survivor. So we have the physical strain of the survival aspect, along with having all of your friends die and get wiped out in one night, and there's also the serious mental strain, as both characters are psychologically tortured by the demonic entities around them as well. It's enough to make you want to go insane, or go berserk. Then, of course, we have the physical similarities of the characters. Both tall, dark hair, in reasonably good shape, and if you count the Army of Darkness poster, well, yeah, their body types are pretty much exactly alike. Bruce Campbell has never looked like this a day in his life. But the most prominent feature is that they are both missing a limb. Yes, both characters had a moment where they needed to cut off a part of their own arm and afterwards attached weapons to the stump. In Berserk, an apostle clamps down on Guts' arm, and in an attempt to save Casca, he viciously rips off his own arm in order to escape. For Ash, his hand begins to be possessed, and before it can take over his entire body, he pins it down and uses a chainsaw to cut it off. Afterwards, Guts gets a prosthetic arm that is interchangeable between a crossbow and a cannon. It becomes quite the ace in the hole when he faces down particular demons. Ash just straight up attaches the same chainsaw he used to cut off his hand to become his new hand in order to fight back with, as well as keeping a shotgun strapped to his back. So yes, both Ash and Guts, in a way, have a boomstick. Also, the official English translation of the manga, when Guts gets his prosthetic arm, they have him saying this. I don't know what it says in the Japanese version, but this is 100% the translators acknowledging the similarities between the two. Now, if you're wondering if there was any specific influence intended from one to the other with these one-armed, demon-fighting, mentally damaged boys, well, Evil Dead 1 and 2 both released before Berserk's creation, with Evil Dead 2 coming out in 1987 and Berserk officially starting in 1989. However, there is a quote from Kentaro Miura, the author of Berserk, that is really amusing. He says that he was a fan of Tim Burton and Sam Raimi, and that when he was in college, it was the day that he finished the first episode of Berserk, and he went to see Evil Dead 2 playing in the theater. He said it was so similar to Berserk that he was really surprised himself. He goes on to say that Evil Dead 2, which is known as Captain Supermarket in Japan, I guess, which is really funny, the main character had cut off his arm and attached a chainsaw to his arm and had a shotgun on his back. I was like, what the? Because Guts has a gun on his arm and a huge sword on his back. It was just like Ash. I remember getting worried that I might get sued. Just finished my first cartoon and I was already nervous. So yeah, it was one of those moments where Kentaro Miura was sitting there in the theater, seeing the similarities on screen and just thinking, oh shit, I wonder if they're gonna sue me. Thankfully, they never did. What I find even more interesting to that, though, is how Evil Dead 3, known as Army of Darkness, takes Ash back to medieval times. Essentially, the same setting and time period that Berserk is placed in. At this time, Miura was not even midway through the Golden Age arc, but both characters were swinging around swords and fighting on top of castles at roughly the same time in 1993. There's also this iconic opening of Army of Darkness with Ash trapped in the pillory, stub arm and all, and a few years later in the manga, we'd see Guts in a similar position. This one is probably a stretch, but years later, after the original cast of Berserk had died off except for Guts and Casca, Guts acquired a new group of characters to help him on his journey and in his battle against the demonic forces. Evil Dead was gone for many years, but eventually returned in the Ash vs. Evil Dead TV series in 2015, in which Ash establishes a new group of characters to help him fight against the demonic forces. They call themselves the Ghost Beaters. Yeah, come to think of it, I don't think Guts' group ever established a title for themselves. They should work on that. So though there is confirmation that Miura had seen the Evil Dead movies and is a fan of Sam Raimi, I can't find anything that states that Sam Raimi is aware of or knows about Berserk. I hope that he does, and maybe if I ever get the chance to meet him, I'll ask him. I first became aware of Evil Dead way back in my early teen years, and it's one of the biggest movies to ever inspire me to want to make movies and videos of my own. It held a very significant impact on me even to this day. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I got into Berserk. But it was a series that created a deep impact and inspired me in a different way. It inspired me to keep struggling and moving forward in spite of horrible circumstances, and also was a testament to some of the greatest writing in a story I'd ever seen. And in a strange way, Evil Dead kind of represents that too, just in a much wackier kind of way. Both had huge impacts on me, and both main characters are characters that I absolutely adore in different ways, but also in a similar way. So have you guys noticed the same similarities between Evil Dead and Berserk? And are there more that I missed? Let me know in the comments, but also let me know what you think would happen if Guts and Ash ever met up. Like, let's say the portal at the end of Evil Dead 2 sends Ash to the Berserk medieval times instead. The man has all kinds of dumb luck and perseverance to at least survive for a while. I think Guts would probably not think twice about him at first seeing him, but once they're back-to-back fighting demons together, Dragon Slayer and Chainsaw, Boomstick and Arm Cannon, I gotta believe there would be some brotherly love to be had here. Anyways, let me know what you guys think about the similarities between Evil Dead and Berserk. Also, thanks for watching, guys. I do deeply appreciate it. Please give the video a thumbs up in the comment to help it out in the algorithm. Consider joining the Patreon if you want to help support the channel. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you next time.